Great. All right. So it's nice to see everybody. This is our second talk that we've done this season with faculty who helped me out at Prairie Springs. So my name is Jenna Gatsky. I am the coordinator, but really the director of Prairie Springs Environmental Education Center at Carroll. If you haven't been there yet, please get in contact with me and we'll figure out how we can get you out there to see the place. So this is our second talk, like I said, with Dr. Sue Lewis today. We'll have two more for this year, and then I'm working on getting ones in place for next year as well. But I'm looking forward to hearing what Sue has to say today. If folks have questions or they need anything, just feel free to put it in the chat. And then we should have time at the end too for people to ask things out loud or share comments or anything else like that. I know a lot of you guys know each other and you might want to say hi and wave and all those sorts of things. So that's really good. It's fun to see everybody. Last time I was smiling so much my face hurt, which it's already starting now, which is a good thing. So we'll have Sue. Feel free to start.
All right, I can figure out how to unmute and all of that. I should probably turn the chat off because I'm just going to sit here and smile and see everybody who's in the chat, and it'll just be fun all night. But thank you all for coming. It is such a fun cross-section of former students and friends and colleagues and people that I haven't met but would love to meet, that it's just a joy to be here and be able to connect with you all. Anybody who says that they are big birders can feel free to correct me whenever I say something that's incorrect. I love birds. I love bird watching. I am a mammologist by training, and well, really at this point, oh, there's a word for it, but malacologist. There we go. So I currently work on little amphipods, which are little freshwater crustaceans, but also have been working on birds really recently, just kind of as a new project, not on bird migration, but on cavity nesting birds. But what spends a good chunk of my time is working with students and teaching both the 100 level and the 400 level of our animal behavior major. So for those of you who aren't really familiar with Carroll and our programs, we're one of very few schools in the country that have an animal behavior major. And it's been going for, going on 10 years or so now. But growing super, super fast. We are probably the fastest growing major at Carroll. And so what I'm going to talk about today comes from the 100 level animal behavior class. So a few of you have heard this talk before, but it's probably been enough years that maybe you don't remember all the details. So I am going to share my PowerPoint. Okay. And move my PowerPoint so that it's not covered by all of your pictures. So hopefully, if timing goes well, I'm going to cover 5 questions tonight. Talk a little bit about what kinds of environmental cues trigger birds to migrate and how those cues are perceived. Talk about how they get from point A to point B. How they know to migrate and where to migrate in the first place, and a little bit about the costs and benefits of migration, and then try and wrap up talking a little bit about climate change. So it's a good time for this talk because we're right in the middle of it. We were hiking this weekend. I don't know if, for those of you that are in Wisconsin, the Ice Age Trail Foundation or Ice Age Trail Alliance is doing a special challenge for their anniversary. And so the challenge is to hike 40 miles on the Ice Age Trail in the month of October in celebration of their 40th anniversary. So we were out hiking on the Ice Age Trail, and I was noticing that in addition to seeing thrushes bouncing around in the undergrowth who were just there on their way out, I was also seeing dark-eyed juncos and red-breasted nuthatches, which are one of my favorite birds. And they're new, like we haven't seen those all summer, and here they are. So they are migrating south also, but for us, this is south, or for them, this is south. So they're coming to the balmy, warm southeast Wisconsin climate to enjoy for the winter, and then they'll head further north, anywhere from just up to northern Wisconsin up into Canada. And all of that gets triggered mostly by seasonal changes in day length. So if you think about perception, mostly when we think about what's going on outside and perceiving the changes in daylight, we're really focused on what's coming in through our eyes. And birds get some information from that, but most of the information that's triggering migration is happening through other ways that they're perceiving changes in light levels. For one, they have a gland that's actually located kind of up in the top of their head called a pineal gland. And that is sensitive to light and has photoreceptors cells in it. And then they also have some, it's called deep brain photoreceptors. They're kind of buried way in the middle of their brain in the hypothalamus. And there are 4 different regions in the brain that are responsive to changes in light levels. And it's actually apparently these deep brain photoreceptors. And hopefully nobody's going to ask me how the light gets to the deep brain and that connection, because I do big things. I do like animals. I don't go deep into their brains. But anyway, they get these signals, and these signals translate down into the brain, and that stimulates the brain to release hormones. And just kind of like, you know, we sometimes experience as the light levels change and we start to move into winter, our hormones kick in and they trigger some of the same kinds of things that they trigger in the birds. So they'll trigger increased feeding at this time of year because migration is going to take a lot of energy. So they have to put on extra body weight. And that means they're depositing a lot of fat. Oddly enough, in the winter, we tend to eat more and deposit more fat too. So it also triggers movement behaviors. And it's not necessarily, I mean, even if you have a bird that is normally a migratory bird and they're in captivity, they will start moving more. They'll just jump up and down and they'll skitter around, and they're just more active during the time of year when they're be expected to be migrating. And we'll click into that later because that's actually given us a research tool to be able to better understand migration. It's called migratory restlessness. So a lot of it is in response to changing light levels. There is evidence that they also are responsive to changes in temperature. And so they've done some research on things like white-throated sparrows in a lab. If they are maintaining the sparrows at one temperature in the lab and they change that temperature, so say they lower that temperature in the lab, the birds will start to do a lot of those same things. They'll start to show migratory restlessness. They'll start to increase their rate of feeding. So it's not just day length, but probably a combination of day length and changing temperature. And that temperature piece, we will also circle back to at the end, because as we think about climate change, that's one of the areas where if the climates are changing and the birds are responding to temperature, then that will potentially change the timing of when they're going to migrate. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes that causes problems. So the issue of how they find their way, so really an issue of how do they orient and how do they navigate. So if you've done, you were back in Scouts in the day, you might have done some orienteering. And when you were orienteering, you were given a compass, and either you were given a pathway to follow, or you were given a map and said, okay, you're here, here's your compass, you need to get over here, and you had to figure out how to do that. So it's a combination of 2 processes. It's a process of orientation, which is just figuring out the right way to go. And just like we do when we hold a compass in our hand, a lot of that orientation happens because they're figuring out which way is north. And most migration happens on a north-south pathway, but even when it doesn't, the birds seem to be responding to where is north and then orienting their direction of travel relative to where north is. Navigation is what we do very handily with our GPSs now, but it's figuring out not just where north is, but you have to figure out how to get where you want to go. And so as we think about what they're doing, we're kind of trying to better understand both the orientation piece and the navigation piece. So they have two senses that help with this, and not maybe senses in the same way that we think about touch or taste, but kind of. The first of those senses is a map sense. So that is, where am I geographically? If I handed you, I kind of kidnapped you, blindfolded you, put you in a soundproof box and plopped you out somewhere in the middle of Prairie Springs and said, okay, donuts are back at the fields or at the environmental center. I'll meet you there. Here's your map and here's a compass. You're good to go. But if you don't know where you are, then that map and that compass aren't going to do you much good at all. So the map sense helps birds to figure out where they are geographically. And a lot of how they do that is kind of the same way that we do. I know I can only see a subset of pictures on my side, but I see John Harret's looking at me. And I know that if I took John out to Prairie Springs and I plopped him somewhere in the field station, he knows enough of the visual cues that he would be able to get back to the building relatively easily. I also see Tina Schneider, and I'm pretty sure that if I dropped Tina out in the middle of the forest somewhere, she'd probably figure it out because she's smart, but she's not going to be able to do it with visual cues. Okay. The kinds of visual cues that birds are going to use, they can use mountain ranges, they can use rivers, they can use the edges of forests. More and more, they can use human landmarks, so cities, tall buildings. Those all create part of the visual landscape for the birds, and they know those cues well enough to be able to orient themselves as to where they are. The second set of cues that we're finding that birds use, and this was kind of a surprise because we tend to think that birds don't have a very good sense of smell, but there is increasing evidence that they use olfactory cues. So a lot of the research, both with the visual cues and the olfactory cues, comes from homing pigeons and doing research on homing pigeons. It's easy to study orientation and navigation in homing pigeons because A, they're really good at it. B, we can let them go pretty much anywhere and follow their path because we know where they're going. We know exactly where they're going. They're all going back to their roost. So we use them for research quite a bit. And there's some evidence, this was coming out of Europe, that there were some really kind of major, I want to say some kind of like meat processing factory that was changing the olfactory landscape of the area. And they discovered that birds were migrating or navigating back to their home roost differently on days where the plant was really active and on days where the plant was less active. And that was kind of what gave them some of these cues that olfaction was really important. The third area that they use, we think, for knowing where they are in the landscape are geomagnetic cues. And I'm going to talk about those more later, but basically that is the Earth's magnetic fields or even local magnetic fields that they can perceive that help them get information about their location. The second sense or kind of combination that they're using is their compass sense, and that's to figure out, okay, I know where I am because I can see the landmarks or I can smell the landmarks. How do I get, where's my destination? So if I know where I am, I know where my destination is, and I know which way north is, then all of a sudden those tools that I have available to me become useful. So we know from a variety of different research methods that the compass sense relies pretty heavily on the sun for birds that migrate during the day and stars for birds that migrate at night. We're pretty familiar with the day migrating birds. So we see the ducks flying south for the winter. We see the geese flying south for the winter. A lot of larger birds, hawks, turkey vultures, and some smaller birds, things like red-winged blackbirds. You'll see these big flocks forming, and they're all migrating during the daytime and use the sun to find their way. A lot of the smaller birds, the songbirds, the warblers, are going to migrate at night instead of by day. And that's probably as a way to avoid predators because they're going to be heading into really unfamiliar landscapes. It also, by migrating at night, gives them the chance to spend the daytime eating and recouping a lot of the energy that they've lost when they were migrating. So, combination of reasons. But with both of these senses, they've used a couple of different research techniques to figure out how important they are. And I wanted to talk about one of those, which is, it's called an Emlyn funnel. It's named after Steve Emlyn, who was an ornithologist from Cornell. It is exactly what it sounds like. You put the bird in a funnel. Down at the bottom of the funnel, there's an ink pad. So every time the bird lands flat on the bottom of this enclosure, it gets ink on its feet. And there's filter paper wrapped around the edges of the funnel so that if the bird is bouncing around in this cage, it's jumping up onto the filter paper. And the pictures that you see where it says spring and fall are the footprints that a bird has made. This is a white-throated sparrow. And so if the white-throated sparrow is in the Emlyn funnel in the springtime, all of these little bounces that it's making are predominantly oriented to the north. And in the fall, all of these little bounces that it's making are predominantly oriented to the south. This would be true if the bird was able to see the sky straight above it. It's also true if the bird can't see the sky but can see some simulation of the sky, like you create, well, for night migrating birds, you put it in a planetarium. So put it in a planetarium, they can see stars. That's enough for them to figure out where north is and which way they're going to be bouncing. The fact that they're bouncing at all ties back to that migratory restlessness I was talking about. So they are restless, but they're directionally restless. And this provides all sorts of cool research opportunities. So you can do things with night migrating birds, put them in a normal planetarium. You can make the normal planetarium, the stars all rotate around the North Star, and the birds will head north. But if you decide to mess things up a little bit and you say, well, I'm going to, instead of having all the stars in the planetarium rotate around the North Star, I'm going to have all the stars in the planetarium rotate around Arcturus, another star in the solar system, or in the night sky. If you change it so that the stars are all rotating around Arcturus, the bird will start orienting toward Arcturus rather than orienting north. So whatever direction in the sky Arcturus is, I can't remember, but that's the way the bird will start to orient. All of these hops, instead of going true north, are going to go toward Arcturus. So they seem to be responding to the part of the sky that everything else is rotating around. For the birds that are migrating in the daytime, you do the same kind of research, and one of the things that they can do is clock shift the birds. So keep the birds in captivity. Instead of being on a normal light-dark cycle where it gets light at 6 in the morning and gets dark at 6 in the evening, you can set them on a cycle where maybe it gets light at noon and gets dark at midnight. So if you train the bird so that it thinks that it gets light at noon and dark at midnight, and then you put them in an Emlyn funnel where they can see the normal sky, they are going to shift 90 degrees from where they would normally orient. And I'm not going to do this well off the top of my head, but if a bird thinks that it is let's say a bird thinks that it's noon, and in the northern hemisphere at noon the sun tends to be toward the south, but it's not actually noon, it's actually 6 o'clock in the morning. So at 6 o'clock in the morning in the northern hemisphere, the sun's in the east. But the bird is trying to migrate south. It thinks the sun is supposed to be in the south at noon, and so it goes toward the sun. And that means that the bird is, instead of actually migrating south, it's going to be migrating east. It's going to be going straight toward the sun because it thinks the sun should be in the south because it thinks that it's noon. So it's a little complicated. It's a test question that my students hate, but it's really interesting because it shows, we know that birds can perceive time of day. They're on circadian rhythms that are also processed in their brain, and so they have an understanding about time in some way, and they have an understanding about where the sun should be at any given time of day, and they use that information to orient their navigation. So, the geomagnetic stuff is really cool and really complicated, and I'm going to go at more of a surface level on this. First, to point out that it is both a geomagnetic compass and map. So there are aspects of perceiving the Earth's magnetic fields that birds are using to figure out where they are, the landmarks, as well as where they want to go. Some of the research that they've done has been done on homing pigeons, and they have these electrical coils that they stick on their head. So this one's on the top of their head. I've also seen them where they're more Princess Leia style on either side of their head. But they can run a current through it, and just looking at the little graphs on the right-hand side, you can see the top two show how that bird, the direction that the bird travels on a sunny day, if the current flowing through those coils is going counterclockwise or clockwise. And you can see that it shifts a little bit, but that the main overall direction is still consistent. So if it's a sunny day, whether the coils are going clockwise or counterclockwise, or the current in the coils is going clockwise or counterclockwise, they go the right direction. The fact that a current is going through the coils means that it's generating its own magnetic field. So then you do the same experiment on an overcast day, and you can see, just looking at the arrows in the middle of those circles, that if it's going counterclockwise, they're still orienting pretty much in the same direction that they would have been orienting on a sunny day. But if it's going clockwise, if it's going in the reverse direction, so you've shifted the magnetic fields, now they're going in the direct opposite direction of where they would normally be navigating. And again, they're doing this with homing pigeons because eventually the homing pigeons will figure it out anyway and they'll go home. If you do it with migratory birds, you could end up with birds out in the middle of the ocean somewhere, and that's bad. We try not to do that. Okay. So part of the original thinking about how they were sensing this was because birds have this magnetite, which is essentially, it's like little iron filings in their beak and in their inner ear. And just like iron filings, if you expose them to a magnetic field, they orient in a north-south direction. And the magnetite in the bird's ear and in their beak seems to do the same thing. In its beak, it's connected to this nerve called the trigeminal nerve. If you cut that nerve, birds can still figure out which way is north, but they can no longer figure out which way they need to go relative to north. So we know it has something to do with what's going on. Right now, they're thinking it has more to do with the map side of things. And what's been replacing the magnetite as the key part of the compass sense is proteins in the bird's eyes. So there are these proteins that are deep in the retina of the bird, and they're proteins that are associated with their daily rhythms. So the same kind of daily rhythms we have. We wake up in the morning, we get hungry at certain times of day, we get sleepy at certain times of day, all of those same rhythms. The birds have those too, and these proteins seem to be linked to that. But what they're finding is that one or maybe more than one of these proteins are affected, the chemical reactions in this protein are affected by the Earth's magnetic fields. So that depending on the orientation of the magnetic fields, they are chemically different. It actually has to do with like quantum electrons, quantum binding, all sorts of cool stuff. There's loads of cool research on it. But it's sending visual signals, visual information to the brain. So what they think that means is that it looks something like these pictures. So if you're looking out at this landscape, what a bird is seeing, depending on which way it's looking, is these fields that vary depending on whether it's looking due north or due east or due west. It adds that kind of grayish tint to the view that they're getting because the proteins in their retina are reacting with the magnetic fields in a way that they can see. Now, what does that actually mean? We don't know, because we don't know, like, I don't really know for sure what you see when you see something, and I definitely don't know what it means for a bird to see something. But slightly, this is our best guess. This is our best understanding right now, which means if a bird's trying to fly north in the spring, it can actually see where north is and stay on track. So it doesn't have to hold a little compass in its hand like we do, or our phone or whatever. It can just see it. It's looking around and it's like, okay, well, that way's east and that way's west, and I need to go north. And so here we go. Which I just think is awesome. I think is so cool. But there's still a ton of stuff they're trying to figure out about this. This is all pretty recent research. So do this talk again in 5 years, I may have all sorts of new stuff to focus on. But if we move on a little bit, because I'm kind of watching my clock and seeing the time fly. How do they know to migrate, and how do they know where to migrate? We know that for some birds, there is a really strong genetic influence. So they've done things like in gulls, they did cross-fostering experiments. So they took one kind of gull that does migrate and another kind of gull that doesn't migrate. And they took the eggs from one species and put them in the nests of the other species and vice versa. And then they checked to see what those birds did as they were being raised. So the eggs hatched in the nest. So you have non-migratory birds hatching in the nest of a migratory bird, or migratory birds hatching in the nest of a non-migratory bird. They get raised by parents who either do or don't migrate, but opposite of what their genes would say. And then we see what they do as adults. As adults, the birds, the migratory species that was raised by non-migratory parents still migrated. But the non-migratory species that was raised by migratory parents also migrated. So one of those species had pretty strong genetic basis to the behavior. The other species had the ability for environmental influences to override what their genes were saying. Kind of similar, but a different approach to the research. Black-capped warblers are a European warbler species. A lot of migration research has been done in Germany. So a lot of our words, the technical term for migratory restlessness is Zugenruhe, which is migratory restlessness. It's trip restlessness in German. So the researchers that were doing this work in Germany were taking these black-cap warblers, and it turns out that adult black-cap warblers from Germany migrate to Africa in the wintertime, but they do it through Spain. So they'll leave Germany, they'll go to Spain first, and then they fly over and end up in Africa. Whereas the ones from Austria also migrate, but they take a different route. They go from Germany to Israel and then to Africa. So one of them migrates predominantly to the southwest. One of them migrates predominantly to the southeast. They're all black-cap warblers. And because they're all black-cap warblers, they could take males from Germany, breed them with females from Austria, and look to see what their kids did. They had to do this research in captivity and in Emlyn funnels, because if you took the babies and you just let them go, they're going to fly somewhere, but you're not going to know where they went because they're off flying across Africa. But in captivity, and put them in the Emlyn funnels, you can see that while dad is migrating to the southwest and mom is migrating more to the southeast, the babies are migrating more south. Not so much to the west, not so much to the east, even if they've grown up in an incubator and never interacted with any parents. So this can't come from learning. It's coming from whatever information is coded into their genes. At the same time, we know that learning is really important in some species. And so this is a picture of whooping cranes, and a lot of this research is going on right in Wisconsin. The International Crane Foundation has been super involved with helping to rebuild crane populations. Whooping cranes were down to about 45 birds left in the wild, and their populations have grown really dramatically. They're up in the hundreds now, which is awesome. But they're trying to reintroduce a population that used to live in Wisconsin and that would migrate to Florida. That population had been totally extirpated. They're building it back up. And one of the hard parts of that is, how do you build up a population that's migratory when you don't have any adults that are migrating? So they used ultralight planes to teach birds the migratory path. Every fall, the ultralight plane would fly down to Florida, and all of the baby cranes would follow it on its pathway. And then in the spring, I think that the ultralight was also coming back up, although it's possible that because they'd done the route once, they were able to come back up. They're getting to the point now where they have baby birds that are born in the wild and are now following their parents down. So we're slowly phasing out of the ultralight teaching the birds, and instead they're using adult birds teaching young birds to fly. And I just heard this summer, for the first time, whooping cranes bred successfully, not just at Necedah Wildlife Refuge, but also at Horicon Wildlife Refuge. So we have at least one baby bird now following its parents down to Florida from Horicon, in addition to the ones from Necedah. So that's super exciting. Migration's not cheap. It involves a ton of energy, and that's why they're putting on all of this body fat before they go. It also involves barriers. Sometimes birds are having to fly, over Lake Superior, or over the Gulf of Mexico, or over an ocean. And that can be really hard. Humans are making it somewhat harder by creating new barriers to migration. So as we destroy habitat or convert habitat into different forms, that is creating new barriers that make it harder for birds to migrate. They also have to deal with the fact that they're adapted to their northern location, they're adapted to their southern location, but they have to hit everything in between as well. And that can be really stressful. Through that whole stretch where they're migrating, they're having to deal with competition and predation and exposure to disease that they're not experiencing on a day-to-day basis when they're stationary, and those can all be challenges. And I thought a good, examples of how that affects the birds. These are a couple of different small birds that we would find around here. Black-throated blue warblers, 85% of their annual mortality comes during migration. Willow flycatchers do a little bit better, but still 65% of all the birds that die during migration. So it is super costly. Arctic terns are the kind of poster child for migratory behavior because they have the longest migratory route of any bird. They migrate all the way from the Arctic to the Antarctic and back in an annual cycle. And it gives a really good example of how costly this behavior can be, but also transitions to thinking about some of the benefits. So at the northern part, you can see there's a small circle up at the northern part. They spend about a month there when they arrive at the north before they actually go to their breeding grounds. Now on this picture, everything that's in the ocean, but that's kind of greenish or yellowish, is an area of really, really, really high ocean productivity. So they get north and then they sit and eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And then they go and nest. Then they come and they fly south, and you can see they kind of fly south down the coast, the northern coast of Africa, and then the population splits. Some of them continue all the way around the coast of Africa. Some of them cross the ocean there and come down the coast of South America instead. Hit another really high productivity spot, eat and eat and eat and eat and eat. And then when they fly back north, they actually take about a month to 2 months less time to get north. So that S-shaped curve going back up that's white, they do much more quickly. But you can also see that it's not hitting the places where there's a lot of productivity. So basically they're like, okay, we're going to eat as much as we can in the south. We're going to fly fast. And they fly fast by taking advantage of a lot of the prevailing winds. So that trip when they're going from the coast of Africa across to the northern part of South America is all following the prevailing wind patterns. So it cuts down some of the energy of migration. Get back up to that spot, it's really high in productivity, eat and eat and eat and eat, go have kids, do it all again. So that kind of focuses on some of the benefits. One, birds can sometimes track resources, but it also potentially allows them to avoid competition or predation or extreme weather. I'll hit on that in a second. I'm going to come back to the resources. We wouldn't necessarily think that like flying up to the Arctic where summer is so short is a really good way to track resources. But during the Arctic summer, they're getting 24 hours of daylight. So productivity per day actually is really high, higher than tropical rainforests in the Arctic in the peak of the summer. That means that there's lots of plants growing, which means there's lots of insects, which means there's lots of food for all these birds. So they'll go up, breed as fast as they can, and then get out of Dodge before it starts getting cold again. It does give them the advantage of not staying in the tropics where there's a lot of competition and a lot of predation. And one of my college professors, I will never forget this, especially because I found out he was wrong, always loved to trick us. He was my ornithology professor, and he'd say, I bet you all think that the birds are flying south to avoid the cold of the winter, right? And we'd all say, yes, that makes sense. And he said, no, it's really that they're flying north to avoid predators and north to avoid competition that's happening in the tropics because there's so many competitors and so many predators in the tropics. I was pleased to find out, actually, when I started teaching A&B 101 and I was looking at some research, that actually has been disproven for a lot of species. A lot of the species that we have around here, evolutionary evidence suggests that they evolved in the north and then did get out of Dodge. They evolved from non-migratory ancestors and then they started to migrate to get away from the nasty weather. So I love this little bluebird, because the look on his face is kind of how I felt when I was seeing the snowflakes falling today. But saying, okay, I think it's time to get out of here because it's starting to snow. So that brings up climate change. So when Todd did his talk a month ago, one of the things that he really talked a lot about, and that it's really cool, is the importance of citizen science research. And a lot of this that I'm talking about is coming from citizen science research. So they've taken these massive databases of bird watchers and looked at them to see what's going on. So one study found that between 1995 and 2018, the timing of birds' arrival at various places in their migratory path has shifted by about 2 days per decade. And another study, this one wasn't a citizen science one, but found that across 40 years of recent time, that the average body size of birds is getting smaller and their wings are getting larger. And they think that these are adaptations that may be helping them to migrate more quickly, because as the climate's getting warmer, they may not have to migrate as long distance, but they might need to do it more quickly. I'm going to skip the how we can plan for it, but it's kind of a cool. Audubon has looked at climate change and bird migration paths. And so if you Google Audubon bird migration and climate, you'll find a simulation where they've tried to map out what are the paths that the birds are going to take as they shift their ranges and shift their migratory paths, because those are the places that we're going to need to protect. But I just wanted to show a couple of examples of some of these, some of the citizen science data. So you take something like the top bird is, actually I'm going to do the second one because they're prettier. Scarlet tanagers, beautiful, beautiful bird that we see around here. The purple line on that graph is showing how temperature has changed from 2003 to 2010. And then, so it's gone from, compared to long-term averages, it's been about a 5-degree warming, but still kind of below in the particular location that they're looking at, a little bit below. But you can see that the bird arrival dates are very closely corresponding to that. So birds are arriving actually in 2010, much earlier in the year. So 124 is the Julian day of the calendar. But about, I can do math, 8 days earlier that they're arriving by 2010 compared to 2003. So we're seeing these changes both on an individual species level and kind of on a composite level. And what's interesting about that, and where it's potentially problematic, you can see that for the Townsend's warbler, a western species, the birds are shifting the timing of their migration based on the cues that they're perceiving, but the plants are also shifting too. So the plants are getting greener by about 2.7 days per year in the range of Townsend's warblers, but the bird arrival is happening about half a day per year, half a day later per year. So over the span of the study, the mismatch between when the birds were getting there and when things were greening up increased by about 2.5 days. And same with the yellow-billed cuckoo, a little bit smaller magnitude, but a change of about 1 day per year. So that's one of the big concerns, because as the plants green up at different times, that also has to do with insect availability or fruit availability. So the food sources are changing, and we're worried that that's going to have some pretty significant consequences for the birds. All right, I'm seeing my clock telling me that things are going on, and I'm seeing questions popping up in the chat that I probably should have let somebody been feeding me all along. But let me get out of my screen and back over to the chat. So questions, John or Zach or Jenna, do you guys want to feed me questions? Are there things that I should be answering, or?
Kimberly just had one. So do all birds have that magnetite in their inner ear and beak, or just certain species? Or do we know yet?
I don't think we know. Magnetite is this funny thing. One of the things that really puzzles scientists about this whole geomagnetic field thing is the order of magnitude for the Earth's magnetic fields is teeny, 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 tiny. I don't know exactly what 1 Tesla of magnetic amplitude is, but I wrote it down. The Earth's magnetic fields are 30 to 60 millionths of a Tesla in strength. And so, when you're wrapping Helmholtz coils around a bird's brain, you're creating really strong magnetic fields. So I guess Aubrey, the short answer is it exists in many birds. It also exists in other species, and I think there's some evidence that humans have some magnetite also, and we don't know what it does. But yeah, if it's in everybody, I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows for sure.
Okay, awesome. We just have a few comments talking about how awesome birds are, and citizen science also. You've got a former student who's wondering, besides the obvious impact of climate change and habitat loss, what would you say is one of the top significant threats for migratory birds?
I like the obvious ones. Probably, it's sort of related to habitat loss. There's the urbanization piece, the forest fragmentation piece, but there's also contaminants. And so when you think about some of even the microcontaminants that might be disrupting endocrine function, every time you're moving into a new habitat, you're potentially picking up more of those. And so I think that's a potentially pretty big problem because, like I'll take DDT, for instance. We don't use DDT in the United States anymore, but it doesn't mean it isn't used anywhere. And sometimes with really good reasons. If you're trying to deal with malaria, you're using potentially DDT to coat the mosquito netting to keep people safe from getting this really awful disease. And so there are still places where DDT is being used. So a migratory bird isn't exposed to DDT when it's in the northern part of its range, but it could be exposed to exposed to DDT when it's in the southern part of its range. And I think that would be, what I'll pick as my top 3. So there we go.
Kimberly was wondering too, tips or best ways to explain kind of what you've been telling us to just kind of a general layperson or even science skeptics.
So I say Kimberly's cheating because, so for those of you that don't know Kimberly graduated this past year and is now working in Vermont as a raptor educator. So she would be high on that list of people who are watching this who probably know more about this than I do, and who are teaching about it on a daily basis. So I wish that I could say that, you'd put out this convincing evidence and then everybody's good, but that doesn't seem to be what's working very well. I like the things, and maybe this comes back to Todd and citizen science, getting people involved in doing the science. I think that if people can be involved hands-on, even if it's just for a day, but you're involved hands-on in like, okay, we're going to go out and do a breeding bird survey, and here's where that data is going to go. And then you talk about some of the information that's come from the breeding bird surveys that have been done over the last 50 years. I'd like to think that that would be convincing because somebody's actually done it. Like, okay, I know this isn't that fake kind of science that I hear about on the news. This is real science because I've done the real science, and this is figuring out what kinds of birds are in our environment nesting. And if somebody else 10 years ago was doing the same stuff that I'm doing now and figured out that the birds were nesting later than they are now, like, that's kind of interesting. Like, what would explain that? And maybe that would help to open the door a little bit, but I'm not sure.
And then last question that's in the chat, and then if anyone else has more questions, feel free to just shout them out afterwards, even out of the chat. But John was wondering, so the Earth's magnetic fields are shifting at a more accelerated rate. So what impact will this have?
I don't know. The whole fact that like the Earth's magnetic fields periodically just totally flip, you know, and I know that it happens. I know we can see evidence of it from, you know, rock strata where you can see that minerals are oriented one direction and then, you know, they're oriented and that everything is flipped in this fairly short span of time. But how that affects, you know, whether it's bird migration or how it affects even our own systems, like what happens when the poles shift, I don't get that at all. I had physics from somebody who tried to convince me that he could teach everything with the use of a rubber ball. And I was pretty sure he was wrong. And I'm still pretty sure he was wrong because my physics background is not at all strong. So, so I don't know what to tell you, John.
All right, so I'll just open it up. If anyone has any comments or other questions they want to share, we don't have 300 people on the chat, so you should be able to talk with no issues. So if anyone wants to share anything.
Do the thickness or texture of feathers change prior to or after migrating in terms of what they need on like their exterior to either survive in their environment for a while or kind of during their trips?
Well, so two thoughts on that. One is that molting typically does happen like right before migration. And that means that the birds are starting that trip with the strongest, best feathers. So I could see that being advantageous. The other thing that's really cool about birds, if you actually hold a bird in your hand and kind of blow on it, they don't, like, most of their body is not covered in feathers. They have tracks of feathers and then bare skin in between. And the feathers that are in the tracks spread out over their whole body. And I think a lot of that is kind of a weight-saving adaptation as it is. But I think about if you go bird banding, so the Urban Ecology Center in Milwaukee is awesome, and they do these bird banding events. But this time of year, if you go bird banding, they blow on the bird and kind of push those feathers aside. Most of the birds that you see will have just like their whole throat and all the way down to their abdomen is bright yellow because they have this massive amount of fat built up. But then sometimes you can also catch birds that are migrating that maybe just arrived after a long part of their migration, and they're going to sit in, you know, Washington Park and eat berries for a while. And so there it'll just be totally concave and there's no fat deposits at all. Which has nothing to do with their feathers really, but you see it really well when you look between the feathers. But it's also, you know, there's a cost benefit there from a weight perspective because you need the fat, you need to put on that fat for energy, but it's also heavy. And so birds will kind of put on a bunch of fat, migrate as far as they can until they're pretty depleted, and then eat, build up some more fat and go some more. So like the thrushes that I saw had probably come down from Canada, had stopped in the Kettle Moraine to eat for a while, and then they were going to pick up and move further south. So it's all this cost benefit of like, how can I get going as effectively and efficiently? How can I travel as efficiently as possible?
It's
I
fun.
have another question, Dr. Lewis.
Hi, Nick.
How you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. What's your thoughts on feral cats and their population, their impacts to migratory bird populations? I know in the restoration world, there's been a lot of talks about feral cat removal. A lot of people tend not to want to do it because of the ethics and the ties to humans have with outdoor cats. So I just was interested in your opinions.
I don't know. I mean, well, it's entirely possible. I mean, like I was saying with predation in general, I think anytime you're out of your normal home range, you're going to be more at risk. So it probably does have more of an impact on migratory birds than on, say, like the chickadees that are going to be around here all year round. I'd love it if people could keep their cats inside all the time, because there's lots and lots and lots of evidence that cats are a major source of mortality for birds, and that's really problematic.
I think the easiest mitigation technique that I think I've heard about are people just putting bells, because birds tend to be pretty, they hear the bird coming. Some cats are still obviously really good predators.
Yeah.
But like I said, it's been a big talk in the restoration world for us. I think the most recent numbers I've seen, they've estimated that maybe 12 species have gone extinct, primarily due to cat predation.
Wow.
And they estimate up to 5 million migratory birds worldwide are killed by feral cats. Or no, 5 million in the United States.
Yeah.
Are killed
Wow.
by feral cats, which is,
it's just
quite a bit.
phenomenal.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know, I'm thinking about the Humane Society locally, and they are trying to save as many cat lives and bird lives as possible. One of the things that they do is, if people bring in feral cats, they'll spay or neuter them, so at least they're not out reproducing. And then they have a barn cat program, so for people that live on a farm, and at least want to have mousers around, and I think the hope is maybe there's enough mice on the farm that they can have them there and keep them well fed without, but if they're still going to be outside, they're not reproducing, that's better than they are reproducing. It's a tricky balance. I love all the educational programs that talk about why it's really important to keep your cats inside. I think that's ideal, but I think, if you're looking at that many species going extinct and that many birds being killed, I don't see cats going extinct nearly as quickly. So.
Hi, Sue. I had a question.
Hey, how are you? Another person who probably teaches about this way more than I do. So.
I mean, I have a bit.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of research in like why they migrate, but is there any research determining like why they choose the locations that they migrate to? Because I know for some species, it's just getting far enough south to find food, but some species, when they migrate like so far south, what are the reasonings? Is there any research that determines why they're going to that particular location?
I think that like Arctic terns are a pretty good example of, they go that far south because at that time of year, that far south is when their food source is mega abundant. So they're eating food that is very, very seasonal in very, very seasonal environments that happen to be Arctic and Antarctic. And it wouldn't surprise me if you see the same kinds of things. So you look at ruby-throated hummingbirds, which are crazy long distance migrants across the Gulf of Mexico, where they should not be even able to do this, that they're probably heading to a place where the abundance of flowers is going to be consistently high for the non-breeding season. But I also, one of the things that I took out of this talk, and it gives me a cheap excuse to add it back in, birds are super, super specific. So many years ago, I was up at Horican Marsh when they were doing a bird banding program, and we caught a little, I don't remember what kind of bird it was, but tiny little warbler that had already been banded at the same location. It had been banded like within 50 feet of where we caught it 3 years later. So they're not just migrating back to Wisconsin, they're not just migrating back to whatever county Horican Marsh is in, but they're migrating back to the same bush. And people have been looking at that and looking at what the function of that is. And the paper that I read said that their hypothesis was that it promoted adaptation to very, very local parasite loads. And so if you come back to the same bush, your exposure to very specific parasites is going to be, it'll be the same parasites that you were exposed to last year and the year before and the year before. Whereas if you migrate even a short distance away, the parasite community might be slightly different. And I thought that was really interesting that, I think it's fascinating that they can get back to the same bush, but that part of the value of that might be that they're avoiding even just a little bit of diversity of parasites. So, parasites and disease are a huge thing that we know very little about, and we haven't, I'd say, except for the last 10 years, probably, we haven't spent very much time thinking about it. Now that we're thinking about it, we're realizing that it's all sorts of crazy stuff going on.
So I've got one more question, and then maybe this is a good place to end it. So Let's say all I know about birds is what you just told me. And now I'm interested in knowing more. What would you suggest are some good places to start to learn more and understand more, and where should you start?
Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology has massive amounts of educational materials on all things bird related. So they are the primary driving force behind eBird. So if you just want to be able to identify birds more readily, like there are wonderful field guides, you can get all sorts of cool field guides, but now we can do a lot with your phone. So you're out and you see a bird and you're trying to figure out what it is. You can get on eBird, which is, iNaturalist will do something similar. eBird is just for birds. Start popping in as much information about this bird as you can, and because it's already geolocated, can tell you, okay, based on the information you've given, here are the 3 birds we've narrowed it down to, and then the cues to be able to sort that out. So I think that's an amazing resource. I think it's a really nice way that you can go out with an inexpensive pair of binoculars and a smartphone and get started with bird watching. There are local clubs in Waukesha. There's the Benjamin Goss Bird Club, which gets together. I don't know what they're doing with COVID, but they get together once a month. And it's all just people that love bird watching and have been bird watching for many of them longer than I've been alive, and know way more about not just like where to find the birds and what time of year you're going to see this and what time of year you're going to see that, and how to tell the difference between a male and a female of this particular species. So, finding the people who are passionate about this can be a great, it gives you a social outlet too. So those are the things that come off the top of my head as really great resources. I'm also seeing in the chat that Nick said that same level of site fidelity occurs in fish as occurs in birds. So that that fish are migrating back to the same little patch of stream that they had been in or that they were born in, at a really, really, really tight level of fidelity. So yeah, I had, for a while, I had other slides in about like, and here are some of the other things that migrate, but yeah, then I realized that y'all weren't going to want to be on Zoom for the whole night, so I started cutting.
Thank you so much for what you did put together. It was really, really good.
Oh,
I
good.
found it
Thanks.
very interesting.